Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Williams, the Library Services Coordinator, and I'm extremely excited to have Doug Graeme and Richard Graeme here tonight with their newest book, which is actually two books, which we do have on the shelves at the Copper Queen Library, although I believe at least one of them is currently checked out, but you can put yourself on the hold list. And before we start, I would just like to honor a legend of Bisbee, of Bisbee mining history, Bisbee culture, and the knowledge of mineralogy from the Copper Queen mine and further. And that is your father, Richard Graeme. And Annie's here, and Nina and Jennifer and the family. And I just, Annie posted an article today. It's a first person remembering Dick Graeme, sorry, by Bob Jones. And I just wanted to read the first paragraph to just give you a taste of really the monumental effect that Richard Graeme had, not just on our community, but on mineralogy and mining. The science of mineralogy in Arizona, and especially Bisbee, Arizona, has lost a giant in the field with the passing of Richard Graeme this past May, 1941 to 2021. Richard was a dear friend and had unparalleled knowledge of the mines, mining, geology, and mineralogy of the Bisbee copper deposits. Born in Bisbee, he spent his early life as a collector. He knew all the old timers whose knowledge he sought. As soon as he was physically able, he spent time in mines and dumps looking at local collections. He undoubtedly handled more Bisbee specimens than anyone else. His in-depth knowledge was so great, you could hand him an unknown specimen from any mine in Bisbee, and he could identify the mineral, which mine it came from, very likely, the mine level where it occurred, and even the time period when it was mined. As an example, I had a specimen of massive black sphalerite, which fluoresced a nice orange. I knew it was from Bisbee, but that was the extent of my knowledge. He immediately identified the mine and stope, where it had been mined. He even told me how the miners could distinguish the sphalerite in the dim recesses of a mine tunnel from identical looking copper sulfide veins within it by simply drawing a rock pick across the face of the tunnel face. The sphalerite would spark and the sulfide would not. And I love personal accounts, but also how we learn these amazing things from people. And so our condolences to the loss of your father, but also our gratitude, for giving so much to Bisbee and to the history. And I brought my little root amethyst that I got at the Copper Queen Mine gift store, which is filled with really beautiful specimens of rocks and minerals. So with that, Doug and Richard Graeme.
Well, good evening. This is my brother, Richard. My name is Doug. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a PowerPoint with just a brief overview of the mineralogy in Bisbee. Let me share this for you guys. Second. And start from the beginning. So our interest in mineralogy came with our father. He started collecting minerals in the late 1940s, early 1950s in Bisbee. And after graduating high school, he started working in the mines. One pivotal event that occurred in Bisbee was the 1967 strike. And that encouraged him to go to college. So he spent his time working underground at night and driving to Tucson to go to college. And he ended up being a geologist. And with that job entailed him to work both in the underground division and in the open pit division. In 1983, he published the first Mineralogy of Bisbee. It was done through the Mineralogical Record, and through them, a couple of series of updates. Now, my brother and I got interested in minerals in the early 1970s. And about 35 years ago, though, our interest changed into looking at rocks and minerals that tell stories. Ones that you can see changes in temperature deposition, environmental changes, metal ions going through it, etc. Now, we also got to work on a project with Dr. Sid Williams on Bisbee mineral deposit. It was only a cubic meter of material, but 27 mineral species were discovered in it, some incredibly rare. And so that's where our basis comes from. Now, Bisbee, is a copper mine, home of the Copper Queen mine. For those people who don't know, the Copper Queen mine is actually pretty small. It consists of this, I'm circling with the pointer here, this open cut and this little tiny building which covers the Copper Queen shaft. Now, even though we're a copper mine, this is not how it was founded. It was founded in 1877 by Dunn, Rucker, and Byron, but what they had found was cerussite. Cerussite's the lead carbonate. And this is a specimen here coated with minium from that general area. Now, cerussite, because it's got lead in it, is a very heavy rock. And with a little basic knowledge, they realized that lead and silver are often associated together. So this got them excited, and Tombstone had just been discovered. And see, this develops the mining for Bisbee. Now, if we take a look at the metal production, it kind of hints on the complexity of the mineralogy. Lots of mines produce more than just one metal. It's just not in Bisbee's quantities. To put these things in perspective, Bisbee produced almost 8 billion pounds of copper, which makes us the 7th largest copper mine in Arizona. Almost 3 million ounces of gold, that makes us Arizona's largest gold mine. 102 million ounces of silver makes us the 10th largest silver mine in the United States, and also the largest in Arizona, over 3 times what Tombstone produced. And the amount of lead, zinc, and manganese is quite significant, puts us up in the high numbers in Arizona. Now, we should really start with the basic geology. Now, the ore deposits in Bisbee start about 200 million years ago with a volcanic intrusion, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit. And this intrusion is coming up where the Lavender Pit is. If I'm going to circle with the pointer, anything marked with a GP, GY, PY, IBX, and the GP, this is where that volcanic intrusion came up. When it came up, it shattered the ground, and this allowed the mineral-bearing solutions to filter along the cracks. And this includes the hills there, the ones with Mount Martin, Queen Hill, Bucky O'Neill Hill, and copper got deposited up in those. One important feature that we're going to be coming back to is the Dividend Fault. And you guys have seen it. If you guys have been to the library, if you step out the bottom of the steps into Main Street, that's the Dividend Fault zone. And it cuts from there all the way down towards the cemetery in Bisbee. Oops.
Okay. One of the remarkable things about Bisbee and that puts it in a world class is not only the beautiful azurite and malachites and calcites and coppers, is the broad diversity. Bisbee produced 337 mineral species, different mineral species that are distinct, and this list has them. It does not include anything that has been discredited or is questionable. Okay, they might be noted on the list, but then they're have a question mark by them. So the 337 number is huge. It would be the second most abundant mineral producer in Arizona, in the United States, after Franklin, and definitely in the top 10 in the world.
Now, how did all this get to Bisbee? And now this drawing's not to scale, and we're going to be talking about what has occurred. I've put a little stratovolcano, and there's Bisbee there. What's occurring off the coast of California? The oceanic crust is getting subducted, and with it, and this is very important, it's carrying water. And when it reaches underneath Bisbee, because it has a lot of water in it, the water actually lowers the melting temperature of the rock. And you'll see these little plumes of magma come up. And they built up underneath Bisbee a magma chamber. Okay. Now, inside the magma chamber, it starts to cool. And it starts to crystallize out. And the first things that crystallize out are your quartz and your feldspars. And now these are like ice. When they crystallize out, they actually expand. And it causes the gold, the silver, the copper, the chlorine, other salts, the water, and this is one theory, to come up and build it up at the kind of the top of the magma chamber. And this pressure keeps building and building and building. And all of a sudden it explodes. Okay. And these solutions are rushing up to the surface. Now, as these solutions are cooling, as they're going upward, they're going to drop out and deposit metals. Lead zinc is about 250 degrees Celsius is when it starts to go. Copper is about 450 degrees Celsius. To visualize this in action today, Mount St. Helens is a stratovolcano. Every time you see it steaming, metals are getting deposited down below.
And so to introduce it, we better talk about hypogene mineralization. Now, hypogene means basically the first group of minerals that get deposited. And along the area where Sacramento Hill is, that little section of the hill and that's still remaining along the pit, okay, this superheated solution comes up. And when the intrusion came through, the first time the magma intrusion came through, it broke up the ground. And if you look at a geology map, there are faults, sort of like spokes coming off of a wheel with the Sacramento Hill area as the hub. And so this superheated water that my brother was talking about shot up in the first stage, and it was containing it contained only iron, sulfur, and silica, which is quartz. Most importantly, the iron and sulfur went out into the limestone and it deposited 500 million tons, at least 500 million tons of iron pyrite, or just pyrite. Okay, the gold, fool's gold type material. Over in the actual intrusion area, the quartz or the silica deposited out. But what's important about that, it basically sealed up the intrusion and it just filled in all the pores. So no other further minerals could be deposited there, or at least of significance. And here's a sample of pyrite from the coal that is from that time period. So it was largely pyrite and quartz at this time. The sulfur is, of course, tied up with iron to make the pyrite. Then the second stage occurs, and it's hard to say how long a time period it was between the two. Then we had a copper and iron stage come in, and it shot up and it went along the edges of these big 500 million ton or multi-million ton bodies of pyrite, and it deposited copper pyrites like boronite and chalcopyrite along the edges. And then in some cases, it actually went into the pyrite bodies and deposited some too. Now, people don't think of Bisbee producing a lot of sulfides, although miners did, because they mined a lot of it. They're just not typically well crystallized or very pretty. So most people don't pay much attention to Bisbee sulfides. The third stage was a little strange. It was lead and zinc. And so we had these solutions just chock full of lead and zinc that shot out, and a little bit of silver was in there too. And it went out into the limestones. but it was somewhat distant from the copper ore bodies that had gotten deposited. It deposited out galena and sphalerite and the those zinc lead sulfide minerals. The final stage, which to a mineralogist was the super exciting one, was, and this is actually an altite, it was a group of solutions that came up and they deposited relatively odd elements like tellurium, vanadium, uranium, bismuth, just mercury, some really what you would not identify with Bisbee. And they got shot up and it was distributed all through Bisbee. The mines in South Bisbee, you could find traces of vanadium and uranium. In the mines at Bakerville, the Campbell, and at the mine at Lowell Junction, and then even all the way up in the Higgins and Southwest, which are closer to the swimming pool in Old Bisbee, you had these rare minerals just shot through them. And a lot of this has been fairly recently discovered, at least in the last 8 or so years. So in Bisbee today, we find about 100 different species that are from the initial stage. And this is a quick list that we have. Scientifically, it's really exciting, although aesthetically, you know, boronite can be pretty, and chalcopyrite again, but most of these are actually tiny little specks in the rock. They're not too exciting. Then to produce the minerals that I think most people think about when they think of Bisbee, you know, the beautiful azurite and malachites, they form in what is referred to as a supergene environment. And what happens is we have surface waters, rain, and at times Bisbee was under shallow seas and oceans. Well, this water seeps down through the ground and it causes with the aid of bacteria, which is also brought down by the water, starts these pyrites and chalcopyrites and boronites, they start to decay. And they make that really rich, blackish, copper-rich water that you would look at. If you look down in the bottom of the lavender pit today, this is the kind of water we're talking about. And this water just seeps down through the ground, and then it will form the malachite and the azurite and the native copper and many of these others. Interestingly, in Bisbee, and now you have to understand is that when the mineralization started, Bisbee was relatively flat. The laramide, which built like the Rocky Mountains and the Mule Mountains and all these had not occurred, and then the Basin and Range mountain building. So it was relatively flat. Okay, and so that's why we can divide it into sections. The eastern section, which is down in Bakerville area and goes down towards Briggs, saw 2 stages of supergreen alteration. The middle section, which is right where the large, deep section of lavender pit and going towards South Bisbee, and then in the South Bisbee and over into Don Louis, we have the sections that saw 3 episodes of supergene alteration. And then in the old Bisbee section up by the library and those areas, there were 4 episodes of supergene enrichment.
We're going to take a look at the episodes. The first episode occurred during the late Jurassic, early Cretaceous. As you can see on the screen, it's about 145 million years ago. As my brother talked about before, the beds are flat, are pretty much level. The ore is close to the surface. We're looking at about 30 meters only. The paleoclimates are allowing surface water and near surface water, so real high water tables to develop. Almost all the mineral deposition is subaqueous, so it's forming underwater, and this allows large crystals to form. In the center of the screen right now, we have a 2200 level Campbell native copper. That crystal is almost 6 inches long. Another thing that formed are these large azurite crystals. Now, this one has been altered to malachite. Okay, this one's off the 1300 level Campbell. Now, areas that were protected by clays is the Czar area, which is, think Queen Mine Tour, that area over there, and then in the junction. Okay, and so these saw subaerial deposition, so open air. So you're going to get things like stalactites and things like that forming. One of the neat things about the junction material is when you hit the open pockets today, you'll see stalactites. You know, at one time they were vertical, but now they've been tilted in there. So you can tell that they're pre-tilt. Harvard in their mineral collection has an excellent one from that time period. There's a junction azurite. You can see the biomorphic shapes to the botryoidal shapes. That's open air deposition right there off the 770 junction. So it's pretty close to surface. Now, the second episode is in the Middle Cretaceous. It's about 100 million years ago. It's not a whole lot is going on here. It's pretty mild. For the mineral people, the most evident thing that you see is second generation overgrowth of azurite on top of malachite pseudomorphs of azurite on that. A couple interesting things have happened geology wise. There's a lot of erosion going on, and it's forming the glass conglomerate. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The Dividend Fault of the south side has dropped 1,000 feet. So that's quite significant. Copper and cuprite are developing. Again, these are protected in clays. And something that will help spur some very interesting minerals later on is the Bisbee-Manco Sea. It has flooded the area, and it's very brackish. And it is believed to be the source of chlorine, bromine, and nitrogen in minerals in later stages of supergene enrichment.
Okay, and stage 3, although you don't have a lot to say about it, it actually was one of the more important ones. It occurred in the Miocene, approximately 23 million years ago. So geologically, we're talking these things are happening fairly recently. And a lot of the really wonderful azurites and malachites formed at this time. Again, these bumpy forms on this one indicate that it formed in an open air pocket. Large single crystals typically form under a solution. And so they're forming at this time. And you can see another azurite from the Holbrook mine, also from this time period. And then there wasn't any carbonate available, which means that the solutions had to be away from a limestone. Then instead of an azurite or malachite, it would try to form a native copper, or in this case, bright red, very thin little cuprite crystals. That one is off the 400 level Czar. Remember, in this case, unless we start talking about Southwest mine pieces, 400 level means it was approximately 400 feet below the surface. The other two azurites were probably a little bit more shallow, I would say between the 200 and 300 level of the Holbrook mines, the azurite and malachite. One of the things that our work developed, and I think it was really sort of exciting, is that we started to understand that the beautiful azurite roses, and if you've not handled an azurite rose, they are just absolutely incredible, and they just feel wonderful to hold. How young they are, and that when you start thinking about it, makes total sense that they're geologically, that azurite rose that's in the picture there could be maybe 2 or 3 million years old, which of course is a baby in geology. But they form in a really strange environment, or not strange, but unusual environment. Okay, what we had, and hopefully you can see this, we have the Pinal schist, and we had the porphyry over there, which is totally unreactive rock, except it had in it over in the Red Hill, the B Hill area, and the Cochise project area of Freeport, those red hills. They, when you get below the red, you'll find a lot of little pyrite crystals coated with chalcocite. And as these began to alter because of the rainwater, because they can't survive with rainwater and bacteria, they ran into the Dividend Fault, which is at the base of those. It's sort of right parallels Highway 80 as it goes by the pit. Now, over millions of years of activity, the walls of the lavender pit had ground all the rock in between them and turned it into a clay. But on the side of the footwall, which is the red hillside, B hillside, it was very unreactive. So the copper solutions coming out of those red hills went into the fault, and then they traveled through the clays until they got to the opposite side of the fault, which is now in the pit area. And the carbonate, because limestone is calcium carbonate, reacted with the copper solution and formed these wonderful azurite roses that's just floating inside clays. Then the other remarkable thing that occurred during this time is all the natural caves in the Bisbee area, in the mining area, were being developed at that time. And this is probably the most famous one because it's the only one that's relatively intact. It is officially it's on the 7th level of the Southwest mine, but it's typically called the Higgins Cave locally because most people went through the Higgins mine to access it when it was accessible. But there were large caves in the Shattuck mine, in the Czar, and the Holbrook. There were a couple dozen large caves like this, and then a number of smaller ones went into the thousands. It was just undetermined. By smaller ones, you know, if it was the size of a small house, 8 to 15 feet high, they were just everywhere. And most of them, because they caused a major safety concern with mining, were filled in. This one actually occurred above a body of iron pyrite. So there was no reason to really mine close to it. So it was left unbothered since it didn't affect the mining. All the other major caves were at least partially backfilled, most of them completely. We can see what happens to form a cave. We have our pyrite or chalcopyrite in the limestone, and then we have surface water comes through and it starts oxidizing that with the bacteria, and the sulfur is being removed is what the big thing is happening, and that causes a reduction in volume, and so you get these large caves on top of the copper ore bodies. And so that's why they formed. They're directly associated. And that's why the ore body or the caves that were associated directly with the ore were filled with bright green calcite or blue calcite, or in some cases malachite and azurite, okay, rather than, you know, a traditional Carlsbad type cave with, you know, the creamy whites and the reds. Those do occur in Bisbee, but the really powerful, famous caves, which unfortunately no longer exist, were very colorful. And this shows the just over 200 species that have been found in the supergene environment, and it gives quite a selection. Hoganite is one that's questionable right now. It's being debated. It's identified as Hoganite, but I think it's of a post-mining origin and not a literal true species.
Yeah.
The one thing that's happening, and a lot of people don't realize, is that the minerals are still growing in Bisbee. It's probably doing it at an unbelievable rate in the Campbell and Junction and Coal and some of the deeper mines. But we have pictures here. You can see a tunnel that's being filled with sort of a yellow red. They are iron hydroxides. They eventually will alter and become a mixture of the mineral goethite and the mineral hematite. And those stalactites are often just a few weeks old, and they will actually, that drift may be completely sealed by now actually. And then ever popular and miners like to collect these, and this is one out of the Campbell, is a bird's nest where dripping water would land on pebbles and coat them with calcite and make a nest-like formation. And then you can see a bucket that's being encased in calcite. It has about 4 inches of calcite in the bottom. There's also aragonite with it. The area around the bottom is actually aragonite. It's not calcite. It's a very subtle difference in crystal structure, but it is there. Malachite and azurite are forming right now. They're definitely native copper is forming, and not just as replacements of any steel that's found in the mines, but rather actually growing inside of timbers and just growing inside the rock. This is, just because we did mining here doesn't mean that the mineralogy stops. It's going to continue.
Turquoise, ever popular. I'm personally not a big turquoise fan, but its origins are extremely interesting. And let's take a look at those. What happened during the late Cretaceous or late Jurassic, early Cretaceous is there was a canyon that was cut in Bisbee, and these red dotted lines are outlining this canyon. Okay, one wall, this wall right here is bounded by the Dividend Fault, and it's cutting towards the cemetery out towards Douglas, the road to Douglas. Over time, this got filled in full of glance conglomerate. This is material that was eroded from up where Bisbee's at, the divide, and this canyon got filled in, and it's filled full of penelschist fragments, limestone fragments, etc., pebbles. It's very pebbly. Now, over time, you have from the granite porphyry, which is those orange-colored hills my brother was talking about, the copper solutions have leached out from that and bringing with them aluminum and phosphate, and they've got into this canyon fill. And they've actually replaced some of the little pebble fragments, the glass, and the pebble fragments have turned into turquoise. Now, turquoise is also found as infilling in the voids, especially into the little hydrothermal veins. You'll find little quartz veins running through this. The turquoise, it's actually deep for turquoise. Turquoise is normally very close to the surface. Bisbee didn't hit turquoise for about 60 meters from the surface when they started stripping for the lavender pit. So that's about right in there is where they started hitting the turquoise. Now, we hear a lot about, here's the lavender pit in the early 50s. We hear a lot about turquoise coming from the Sacramento pit. Here's the answer, and this is why it's not true. When they were mining the lavender pit, they did not, in the early stages, they did not have the technology to actually move it all, cost effectively move it over where number 7 is. So what they did is they backfilled the Sacramento pit. And here on the right, you can see where the Sacramento pit is filled in, and it was filled in full of a lot of glance conglomerate, which contained turquoise. And of course, when they did the Holbrook extension in the 60s, they mined all that fill out, and you can still find remnants of turquoise from that. I've actually found it over there in that end of the pit, but I find it really fascinating how the turquoise developed.
Okay, and what the project we're working on with my father and will continue is part of a 3-volume set, although sometimes I wonder if it'll be 4. And the 3rd volume is about half written, but that will be addressing the famous mineral collectors. There were some important ones like Bill Crawford, who sent tons of material to the Smithsonian Institute for Research. And many other, and some really great guys like Melvin Elkins, who passed away not too long ago, Al Voren. There's some really substantial collectors. It also will address mining history. Initially, our goal is probably to address mining history as it affects mineral collecting and mineral preservation. So we would look at square set stoping and why it was advantageous for the preservation of mineral versus although it was limited, they did do block caving in Bisbee, and how that would not be a good, and why the mining technique would prevent minerals from being saved. One thing I wanted to show you, because a lot of the books we've written are available for free download, and I wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity. So if you go to our website, which is bisbeeminingandminerals.com, okay, all the new material typically comes under more, but a few things hang out there permanently, and one of them is going to be downloadable books. And so a lot of our books, most of them are there. The one that was published through Arcadia, it's not. And the post-mining minerals is found in another spot on the site. We're going to try to move it over there. The mineralogy is not there yet. And the reason is that it's being used as a fundraiser for the Mineral Museum going into Tucson and one going into Phoenix. And they've asked us to hold off on that. But eventually, it will be up there for free download and with the eventual volume 3 and things of that nature.
Yeah. Well, that's it on the basics of it.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Guys, any questions?
Yeah, that was an amazing presentation and pretty in depth for basics. So
Yeah, you get pretty technical there.
if anybody has any questions or comments, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can type it into the chat and I can read it out. Can you guys just explain or talk a little bit about you call it the Dividend Fault zone, and
Yeah.
when we took the kids on a tour of the mine, you explained a little bit about that, but can you just elaborate for everybody here?
Yeah, it's a major fault zone. It pretty much goes up Main Street, cuts to the pit. There, it has approximately, let's do 3,000 feet of displacement. And it's a very important structural control for the mineralogy in Bisbee. It gets up to about 106 feet wide. So it's very significant on that.
Explain displacement.
Displacement is offset. So the bottom has been dropped 3,000 feet versus the one side on it. Mining was extremely difficult along it. In fact, pretty much prevented any mining on it. They got into it and they would back out of it. And that's also the reason for no mine workings like underneath the Copper Queen Hotel, that part of Bisbee, because that is non-ore bearing. Okay, that's all Pinel schist. The displacement is caused the erosion of that, and it's gone now.
And that plate shift also, I mean, as a layperson, kind of explain to me a little bit about why the two sides of the canyon are different. People talk about different insects or plants, or why the colors of the earth are different.
It's going to have a strong environmental control, definitely. Because if you look at like School Hill, those are Precambrian rocks. They're like 3 billion years old. They are old. Versus on the end, because they have been uplifted, and all the younger rocks that were once deposited on them have been eroded away. On the other side, where you have the limestone hills, where the mine core is and the Lavender Pit, those are much younger. They're like 300 million years old. And they give evidence of Bisbee being under an ocean for probably 500 million years, ever since the Precambrian, and until, it came up in the late Jurassic Cretaceous. But because of that, the limestones are going to harbor different plant life and animal life than your siliceous or quartz-rich schist on the other side. So that's part of it.
Yeah, chemistry is different. Yeah, so very alkaline on the Bucky O'Neill Hill, Mount Martin side.
Very basic, a lot of, And then, of course, the orange red hill to the key hills, you get very far down, it's going to be very acidic, actually, soil.
Very low pH.
Oh, well, the kids who were on that tour did go home and explain that to their parents, who were surprised and in some cases called or came in to ask us a little bit more. So I think it's really fascinating to understand that geological shift and how it affects present day, right down to having a main street, how that path formed and from horses all the way.
Oddly enough, one of the things that we're working on the website is that we're actually using the Copper Queen Library as our point of reference, because most people know it. It's what Bisbee looked like approximately at the location, and it shows the little silhouette of the Copper Queen Library, what it looked like in the Precambrian, what it looked like in the Carboniferous, and because people just don't really understand how much the environment's changed, the climate's changed. I mean, in the Precambrian, Bisbee had an orange sky because of the methane rich, and the sun was like 75% as bright. And so that's one of the things that's on the website. It's up to the Carboniferous, I believe. The Cretaceous and the Pleistocene, a little bit more difficult for me to draw. Yeah.
Well, Jason's going to be very excited to see that. That is a very cool thing. And it does help too. I actually wanted to ask you the very first picture in the presentation where you show the mine shaft opening. Is that the first Copper Queen Library, that white building?
Oh,
It's 1897, it should be.
Yeah, 1897. So yeah, it'll be, or is it the second?
It's the first, I think. But I don't have a
Yeah.
copy of that. Do you think you could email it to us?
Yeah,
Okay,
I can do that.
thanks. Any other questions, comments?
We could show you some rocks.
I actually have a question, if I may, please.
Yeah.
Let me get my video here. So as you know, I'm a museum person. And so I was curious, what museums house the best Bisbee minerals in the world? What are the best museum held collections?
Okay, the collections, it depends on what caliber. Okay, we have display collections which have incredible minerals, but then you have scientific collections. Of the scientific, Harvard definitely has the best. Okay, and they have a fabulous collection on display, but off-site in a little building, they have the Copper Queen Mining Company collection. And
Scientific collection.
Scientific, it's ores and stuff like that. And the labeling is absolutely incredible. They tell you not only the level of the mine, they'll say it's 20 feet past the mule barn on the left side of the crosscut, or this many sets up the raise. You could walk right to the spot where it came from. So for scientific research, that's absolutely incredible, with that much detail to it. Display collections, the best is going to be the Smithsonian itself and the American Natural History Museum. Don't want to knock British School or Paris School of Mines. They actually have a handful of very, very good things.
British Museum.
British Museum has some very good things.
Denver.
LA County, Denver Natural History Museum. And what's the name of the one in Libya? I forget the name of the museum.
It's not Libya, it's in Beirut.
Beirut, yeah.
It's in Lebanon. There's a wonderful museum in Lebanon that I have not been to. It's fairly new.
Yeah.
And it has some extraordinary Bisbees in it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we've seen the Bisbees before they went there. They got traded out of a couple of US museums.
That's such an excellent question, Annie. And it also, I was thinking about that as well. And I actually have my best friend is in New York. She took her children to the Natural Museum of History and photographed the specimen there from Bisbee and sent it to me and said, "Is this where you live?" And I said, that's it. That's the place.
Yeah.
But all of these amazing specimens have come up and then left Bisbee. Are there any plans to possibly have a public collection or public display here for the locals?
Well, in Bisbee, the museum itself's got a fairly decent collection. Tucson has a great. Tucson has, the new museum at Tucson, that new exhibit is quite good. The University of Arizona's new collection or new site. Forgot about that one. It's they've done something that's kind of interesting with it. They're using a technique where they don't actually own half the rocks that are there. They're on loan and they're going to cycle through every couple of years. I think 18 months, isn't it?
Yeah,
18-month cycles where they're borrowing from private collections and they're able to bring out stuff that just hasn't been seen in forever. Yeah.
One of the things that caused is that the mining companies were very generous and they wanted to share with the world. Well, the problem was in 1890, it was in the middle of nowhere. So Yale and Harvard all got these wonderful collections, the Paris School of Mines, the Sorbonne. I mean, all these guys got wonderful collections because Bisbee was nowhere. And so that's where they ended up with them.
Yeah.
And then the big mineral dealers, because during that late Victorian, the era of really a blossoming of the sciences and everybody was interested in them. The big mineral dealers were all New York and Pennsylvania, and they sold them back east. So many of the truly great Bisbees are on the East Coast or overseas.
And the library itself's got the stuff that came from City Hall.
And it's really a pleasure to have that display. And people do look at it and ask about it. And, we would love to have more, but then we go into security or space, actual physical space, which we don't have the most of, but.
Yeah, and it was a shame a lot of stuff that was at City Hall didn't survive the fire too well. But you got a couple nice azurites, malachites there that came from there.
Anybody else? Anybody have a question or comment? You can just unmute yourselves.
If you want, we can take a look at some rocks. I've got some here.
That'd be great.
Yeah, let's take a look at azurite here. This is one of the Holbrook azurites. Yeah, this is one from the Miocene deposition right there. And then historically important, let me turn that away. This one is Chicago Expo, 1893.
The Columbian Exposition
in
Chicago. That's
Yeah.
where this was shipped out to.
This came out of there, and that got given to the Philadelphia Academy, and then they sold it off a few years ago at auction. Big malachite out of the Lavender Pit. This is from grandfather's collection. Yeah.
Then one of my favorites. Also, can you tilt the light? Back it off. Oh yeah, back it off.
Yeah.
You can see an azurite rose. This one was the one I chose to show a picture of. This is my favorite one. And then this is an odd thing. Mineralogically, is a azurite crystal and chalcocite. Not a particularly great specimen, but scientifically a little confusing.
Yeah.
You would not expect this association,
Yeah.
at least not with an azurite crystal that nice.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a great azurite crystal. It's pretty decent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of an odd environment for that to exist. Yeah.
And Doug, on the that piece of malachite, the outer shell almost looked fused or polished. Is
That's
that
the natural.
that's the
That's a natural surface.
before
Yeah.
you break it?
Yeah, you can take a look now.
This is the natural surface right here. Yeah, it's a botryoidal form, and yeah, that's how it came out of the pit.
Yeah.
It came out of the shallow end of the pit around Thanksgiving of what, 68 or 69?
Somewhere in there, yeah.
It was 68 or 69. I cannot remember right offhand. But they got pieces 200-300 pounds
Of that.
of that material. So it was very abundant. They hit tons of it. Yeah.
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question or comment?
I have another one, if I may.
Of course.
I'm curious as to each of your opinions, and perhaps speaking for Dad also, what is your favorite mineral locality? Which do you feel produced the best minerals?
Ooh,
That's two different questions, really, because the best minerals and what I would have liked are going to be two different answers. I can tell you my dad's favorite specimen was a malachite pseudomorph after azurite, which means it grew as an azurite crystal, converted itself naturally to malachite. And it used to be owned by the barber Esker Mayberry in Bisbee. And which museum?
Rice Museum.
It's in the Rice Museum in Oregon or Washington. I have to look it up.
Yeah.
It's a fabulous piece. That would have been his favorite. I would say the most important mineral locality, and my brother can argue with me because this is an arguable statement, was on the 200 levels R in 1895. They intercepted a cave that was lined with azurite and malachite that was about 60 feet across. And it is unbelievable how many specimens that must have come out and were saved, because it's like everywhere you go, every major mineral museum in the world has at least one. And they tend to be extraordinary. And there are just thousands and thousands of them out there. I would argue that is the most significant mineral locality in a collector viewpoint or a museum viewpoint. Personally, I am very partial to calcite, and I would say the Southwest mine in the ballpark stopes, which is 16 stope, 15 stope in that area, would be my personal favorite. But there's no way that I could really defend that beyond a personal opinion.
Probably the most important scientifically location, I'm going to say, is 15 stope, 5 level southwest. 14 stope.
14 stope.
14 stope. Yeah.
Scientifically,
yeah. So many different mineral species in such a tight location.
Yeah. And a block.
After that, it's going to be the sulfides and the Campbell.
Scientific.
What
would you think on mineral wise? The 1900 maybe?
No, I wouldn't go 1900. I go Holbrook. Yeah. 400 Holbrook.
That's where the big block in the American Museum came from.
Yeah, on the Holbrook Czar side.
4-ton block of azurite and malachite that came off the 400.
Yeah, keep in mind, Bisbee mines are close together due to haulage. You know, the Holbrook and the Czar mines they're 800 feet apart, and so it's not that great a distance. And they mine into each other's ground on that.
That's a wonderful question too, Annie, because it is interesting, the personal relationship that you have both as scientists, but also as a family tradition. And I know when astronaut Mark Kelly was here reading his book Astronaut to the community, somebody asked him what his favorite planet was. And he said, why, this one, Earth. This is my favorite planet. This is the only one we've got. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about grammite and about how you go about what constitutes discovering a new mineral and naming it.
Okay. Well, what happened is first it had to be discovered, and it was found in the coal and which is one of the mines in South Bisbee by my father. He picked it up out of a mine car in 1955, or no, 59. Sorry, I messed up the date there. In 1959, he found it. He misidentified it. Okay, he thought it was a different species. It's a pretty, and I wish I'd taken it out of the case to show you. It's an interesting teal color. And so he kept it around, and I don't really know why. It was not that great of a specimen if it's not a new species. And he finally submitted it to Dr. Sid Williams for to be identified. And when it came back as an unknown. And so Dr. Sid Williams and Dr. Phil Motter did the mineralogical work on it. During the research, another material was found out in near Yuma that also turned out to later be called graphite. So after it was determined to be a new mineral species, they did the crystallography, they even did the Mohs test, the hardness test, the streak, and all the basic. And they determined the composition, which is copper tellurium oxide, C2O3, and then with some waters of hydration tied on to that. Then it was reviewed by the IMA, which is the International Mineralogical Association, and then it came up for naming. And it actually, they recommended, my dad had recommended Douglasite, and after James Douglas, and a handful of other names of prominent Bisbee people or prominent mines in Bisbee. All of them were rejected for some reason. Either they were a slang term for another species, like Douglasite can be, and or the word meant something very different in a different language, so they were vetoed. And finally, I guess they got a little bit, tired of just fighting over a name. Somebody said graphite, and that was it. It was done. And my dad had absolutely nothing to say with it. I'm sure Dr. Williams and Dr. Motter may have had something to say about that, but that was not intended to be graphite. But they just didn't want to, I guess, spend too much time fighting over a name or trying to come up with a name, so they just settled with it.
It's still an honor and exciting, right, to discover something unknown.
It's weird. I think in one of the last things my dad saw, and I hope he appreciated it the way I did, is that it's interesting how a scientific discovery of something that's interesting can just blossom. Because we doing research on graphite, I found a poem with graphite mentioned, and I'm thinking, of all the rocks in the world, graphite really is sort of an odd one. And then in popular culture, Steven's Universe, I don't know if you have grandkids or something floating around, or kids, it was so big on rocks and minerals, and so the fan art shows graphite as a character. And I'm thinking, how would they come up with graphite out of 3,000 species? I mean, that's just strange that they come up with graphite, because it's not that pretty. I mean, it's attractive for a newer species, but it's not like wolfenite.
Well, never question the heart of a poet or a child. Sometimes things just become, they spark a note or become attracted. So
yeah, I just find it interesting how a scientific discovery can just explode off into weird areas. And I think that's neat. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. All right, we have time for one last question or comment, if anybody would like to say anything. Well, let's see, Cato. Bisbee may not have the best mineral treasures, but we have the best treasures in these two exceptionally knowledgeable Bisbee mineralogists. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I will second that.
Thank you.
Yes, that's a great note to end on. Bisbee has gone through a lot with mining, the mining claim. The mine is, of course, cannot be separated from the history of the Copper Queen Library, was started by mining executives, bringing culture to Bisbee in the face of a lynching, the first and last. And what I continue to see in my time here in Bisbee and my work at the library is that people are our resources. We are so rich in interesting and educated and curious minds with a D. And also really lucky to have Doug as the manager of the Copper Queen Mine, and to have Richard as an educator in our schools and teaching to children to inspire curiosity for them to move forward into the future. But as always, I love our patrons and everybody here for continuing to learn, and for you guys to be with us to continue to teach us and expand our knowledge of such an important part of our local environment and our community. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great night.